I never set out to make my life a story worth telling, and I certainly never wanted to become the kind of person who brooded over slights and betrayals. Yet here I am. If there was a single moment when I felt everything shift, it was the day my stepdaughter told me I was just one among a line of husbands her mother had collected, and that there would be plenty more after me. To her, that small sentence might have been a petty jab, just a way of telling me not to bother with fatherly advice. To me, it felt like being stabbed in the back by someone I had clothed, fed, housed, and, most importantly, loved. I remember I was standing in our kitchen, rummaging through drawers for something, probably a stray pen, when my stepdaughter made her pronouncement. She and I had gotten along reasonably well until then, despite the typical teenage ups and downs and a few bristly attitudes. But her words caught me off guard. "You're just one of Mom's husbands, you know. She's had a few before you, and I'm sure there will be plenty after." My hand froze on a half-broken pencil. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. I glanced over at her, and she had this haughty, nonchalant expression, as if she was stating an obvious fact, like the sky was blue or the floor was tiled. In that second, I felt an indignation rise in my chest, something raw and unfamiliar. I tried to stay calm as I asked what she meant. She shrugged. "Exactly what I said. You're not my dad, so why should I listen to anything you say?" I told her I'd known her since she was just a little girl, so little she hadn't even started school. I told her I'd clothed her, listened to her, bought her birthday presents, and treated her as a daughter in every sense except on paper. But the more I spoke, the more defiant her eyes became. That night I lay awake for hours. My wife, let's call her Serena, slept soundly, drifting on some dreamless current I could not join. Our home felt different. 13 years I'd been with Serena, 13 years that I'd also been in my stepdaughter's life. Back then, I thought of her more fondly, a giggling child, always excited for any small gift or trip to the local park. Yet in a single sentence, she had dismissed me, implied I was disposable. I couldn't think of anything else. I wish I could say that night was the worst. It wasn't. It was only the beginning. When I look back on how I grew up, I remember a sense of camaraderie with my own father. We weren't perfect. He and my mother had their squabbles, but I never doubted that he was my father in every sense: official, spiritual, emotional. When I married Serena, I found out she had a daughter from a previous relationship, and at first, I wasn't sure how I'd feel about stepping into a paternal role. Her daughter, let's call her Iris, was about 4 at the time. The father, her biological one, was rarely in the picture. Sometimes he would send a postcard or show up for a birthday, but apparently he'd pop in and out whenever it suited him. I never judged Serena for this. Everyone has a past, and I was willing to make it our present. If anything, I felt an urge to be there for a girl who needed stability. And so, that's what I did for 13 years. Give her a stable home. We didn't do extravagant vacations or live in a mansion, but as the only earner, I made sure we never lacked necessities. I worked at a medium-sized manufacturing plant. Let's call it Builder's Forge, or for the sake of giving it a name, where I inspected newly made parts for imperfections. It wasn't glorious work, but it was honest, and I took pride in knowing I provided for my family. From the outside, people probably assumed we were content. Even on the inside, I thought we were. I liked building routines, waking up at 5 in the morning, grabbing my lunch pail, kissing Serena goodbye, driving to Builder's Forge, finishing an 8-hour shift, returning home to help with dinner, checking in on Iris's homework. She was always bright enough, rarely requiring my help unless it was a specific math concept that tripped her up. I never even noticed any major friction beyond the normal teenage snark. Maybe I was naive, or maybe she kept her resentment hidden until it no longer could stay bottled up. When she called me just one of the husbands in that scornful tone, it took me a few days to share my anger with Serena. You might assume my wife would instantly come to my defense. Instead, I got a lukewarm reaction. She said, "Iris is going through some things. Don't take it personally. You know she thinks of you as a father deep down." But I'd heard those words. "You're just one in a line." and they weren't easy to wash away. I felt the sting as if she had physically slapped me, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had never been recognized as her official father in any capacity. I was not on any legal documents. I'd never adopted her. I'd assumed the role out of love and a sense of obligation. Yet, in a purely bureaucratic sense, I was nobody. Still, I tried not to dwell on it. When she wanted to start college, I contributed to that first year's tuition. I never announced my plans to pay. I just did it. A silent promise to myself that her future mattered to me. The cost was not inconsequential, but I set aside enough each paycheck to make sure she didn't have to worry about dropping out mid-semester. I wanted her to focus on studying, enjoying the social aspects of campus life, within reason, of course. I never rubbed it in her face either. I believe that once you pay for something, you shouldn't hold it over someone's head like a debt. That's not how love works, or so I believed. That changed when the time for her second year of college rolled around. By then, her attitude had intensified. She made it clear that my advice on anything from finances to personal conduct was worthless to her. Her biological father, let's call him Brandon, had reemerged in her life, sending sporadic messages, occasionally dropping her a small check that never arrived on time. He'd waltz in and promise her the moon, then vanish for months, leaving me to pick up the slack. I tried not to be resentful about it. It wasn't her fault, was it? Except she acted as though Brandon was the greatest father in the world, despite the glaring evidence to the contrary. One day, she stormed into the living room, telling me I had no right to speak about her future. My frustration boiled over. "Go ask your biological father to pay for your second year then," I said. "Let him shoulder the burden since he's so wonderful in your eyes." She looked stunned at first. I could practically see the gears in her mind turning, as if she just realized how dependent she'd been on my generosity. Generosity she treated with so little respect. Within minutes, she tried a different tactic. Suddenly, I was dad, and she apologized for her earlier outbursts. She swore I was her true father, that she didn't know what had come over her. She pled for me to give her another chance. I wasn't one for direct confrontation, but I'd had enough. Her prior words rang in my ears. "You're not my dad, and there'll be others after you." I said, "You're old enough to get a job if your real father won't pay. You've made it clear that I'm not your father, so I see no reason to invest in your education a second time." My tone was firm but calm. If it sounded cold, it was because I was finally done being taken for granted. It's odd how something like that can send ripples through your entire life. When you stand up for yourself once, you start to notice every time you've allowed someone to walk all over you. Maybe that's what got me reevaluating my entire relationship with Serena. She might not have been as blunt as Iris, but there were times Serena also let slip that I wasn't truly part of the family. Once, in a conversation with her sister, she claimed I was just the breadwinner, which she quickly tried to pass off as a joke. Maybe it was a joke, but it hurt to hear. Over 13 years, she never once insisted on making me Iris's legal guardian, never once insisted that I deserved that official recognition. A few times I brought it up, but she changed the subject swiftly, as though we could just continue as we were indefinitely. I tried to consider how many times in that 13-year span I'd been truly included. Holidays often revolved around how Brandon was causing drama by forgetting to call or messing up some visitation schedule. Family gatherings on Serena's side always had me introduced as her husband, rarely Iris's father, now, which some folks considered me to be anyway, out of politeness. But behind closed doors, that distinction was something Serena and Iris used as a wedge, a subtle insinuation that I was, at the end of the day, optional and replaceable. Did that justify revenge? I'm not sure if revenge is the word I'd use. But I was no longer willing to let them keep taking from me without giving anything back, be it gratitude or basic respect. Their ingratitude felt like a betrayal, especially from Iris. If I'd known from the start that my role was strictly financial, I might have approached everything differently, but I had believed I was building a family. I suppose we all have a threshold. Mine was that moment when Iris demanded I pay for her second year of college after calling me nobody. From there, my mindset changed. I decided to claim what was mine, the intangible sense of dignity, and deny them further exploitation. I withdrew my finances from college. I told Serena that if Iris needed help, Brandon could pitch in. And if Brandon refused, she could pick up a part-time job and work for it, Iris argued. She tried guilt, tears, then anger. When none of it moved me, she yelled that I was petty, that I wanted to see her suffer. I told her calmly, I just want fairness. She muttered something about hating me, but she needed me financially, so she walked away with furious tears in her eyes. That moment was the final wedge that shattered our family facade. I don't want to paint myself as a saint. I had anger in my heart, more than I cared to admit. I had spent years dealing with slights, little jabs about not being a real father, not having legal rights, being a mere paycheck. Now that anger rose to the surface. Part of me, maybe a larger part than I'd like to confess, wanted them to see how it felt when I was no longer an easy fallback. I wanted them to experience how hollow their words sounded when they had to fend for themselves. Around that time, Brandon tried a sly move. He arrived at our doorstep one evening, claiming he wanted to mend fences. He brought a small gift for Iris, a cheap, flashy necklace. She was delighted and, in her elation, forgot the many ways he disappointed her over the years. He gave me a big, artificial grin, all handshake and forced pleasantries. Then he casually mentioned how he might be short on funds for a while and asked if I could co-sign a loan for him to pay for Iris's upcoming tuition. The nerve, the brazen gall of this man. He'd left me footing the bills for years, came around only to drop a half-hearted check or a borderline insulting alimony payment. He clearly thought I was the gullible type who'd continue to shoulder his obligations. I didn't unleash a flurry of insults. I had no interest in stooping that low. Instead, I said, "You've hardly contributed thus far. If you genuinely want to help Iris, do it on your own." He looked startled and defensive, as though I'd done him wrong. Then he mumbled a few curses under his breath, none of them aimed directly at me, but loud enough for me to catch, and left in a huff. Iris chased after him to the car, presumably to console him and assure him that she wasn't upset. Watching from the window, I felt the old bitterness swell in my throat. This man had waltzed in, demanded something from me, and upon being denied, left me the villain. But that's the thing. You can't let people treat you as a doormat forever. Eventually, you have to stand up. And if they want to call it revenge, so be it. I no longer had any illusions that Brandon or Iris would ever appreciate my efforts. That's when I resolved that I'd never again pay a cent toward her college. If that was my so-called retribution, let it be. It felt more like finally enforcing boundaries than stooping to vengeance. Iris took a hit. She scrambled for scholarships and part-time work. She discovered the harsh truth that college is costly. Brandon promised he'd send money, but by the time the second semester tuition was due, his contribution was minuscule. She ended up dropping several classes and had to consider enrolling at a smaller local institution where the tuition was cheaper. She confronted me, outraged, tears staining her face, cursing her luck. She said that if I truly loved her mother, I would not let her future go to waste. She tried to frame it as my duty as a husband to Serena. I nearly laughed at the irony. A person who had practically spat on my place in the family was now demanding I fulfill a fatherly and spousal responsibility. "Why don't you call me your father again?" I asked. She just glared, words trembling on her lips. "Look," I continued, "I do love your mother. I always have, but you made your feelings clear. You said I was just one husband in a line, that there'd be a bunch more. If so, then those hypothetical husbands can pay for your college if your real father won't." She slammed the door on her way out. I heard her sob in the hallway. As much as I hated feeling vindictive, a part of me believed she had to learn that words have consequences. If she wanted to break me down to a mere financial tool, then she was going to find out what life was like without that tool. I could have forgiven her if it was just a childish outburst, but the smugness in her tone that day How certain she was that she owed me no respect made me realize we'd crossed a line that was nearly impossible to come back from. The tension in our household was palpable. Every dinner felt like an argument waiting to happen. Serena tried to remain neutral at first, but soon enough she took Iris's side. She felt that I was punishing her daughter in a moment when the girl's future was on the line. She argued that this was the time to shape a bright path, not withhold financial support. But I'd heard that same line of reasoning for years, how I needed to do more, while Brandon got to do nearly nothing. So I asked her, if you care that much, why not pay for her tuition yourself? She had no job and lived off my income. She started to cry, accusing me of cruelty, saying I was letting anger cloud my judgment. Maybe that was true. Anger definitely fueled my stance, but the deeper truth was that I felt taken advantage of by both mother and daughter. They expected me to bear the financial load indefinitely, no matter how they treated me. This wasn't a mistake on my part. It was the only method left to shake them from their complacency. During this simmering conflict, I decided to invest my time in a sideline project that I'd been quietly developing for some years. A friend of mine, let's call him Luca, had approached me about creating specialized tools for a niche market. I never told Serena or Iris much about it because I knew they'd either show disinterest or expect a chunk of the profits if it succeeded. So I kept it under wraps. I'd save a portion of each paycheck, funneling small amounts into research and materials. I tested prototypes in my makeshift workshop in the garage after hours. My job at Builder's Forge gave me experience with industrial parts, so I had the technical background to handle it. As the family environment grew more hostile, my focus on this project became an escape. Every success in my workshop felt like a small triumph that belonged solely to me. I didn't plan it as revenge, but in retrospect, there was a certain satisfaction in building a new life for myself. If the day came when they decided to boot me out, or if I decided I'd had enough, I wanted to stand on my own 2 feet, with or without them. Over time, the project with Luca took off. We sold our specialized tools to a few local businesses. Let's name them generically: Tech Solutions and Metalcraft Innovations. The orders were modest initially, but word of mouth spread. Soon we had requests from multiple states. My phone rang with new clients. It felt surreal. For years, I'd poured my money into a family that never quite acknowledged my efforts. Now I had something that was mine, a potential gold mine of my own making. I still lived under the same roof as Serena and Iris, but the mood was cold. It got to the point where Iris avoided me entirely, coming home late and leaving early. Serena and I barely spoke, except to rehash the same argument about paying for tuition. She insisted we needed to put aside family differences for Iris's sake. I insisted that was exactly what I'd done for 13 years, ignored my own needs. She accused me of being heartless. I didn't yell, but I snapped, "For once in my life, I'm not letting you or your daughter use me." She retreated to her bedroom. I slept on the couch that night, a wave of relief mixing with sadness. It hurt that Serena saw me as nothing more than a wallet, but at the same time, it felt good to speak my truth. Some months passed. My project with Luca flourished. Iris struggled with her smaller school, complaining that it lacked the prestige of her original college. She had trouble balancing part-time work and classes. Brandon's grand promises dissolved into a few half-hearted phone calls, where he explained he had financial troubles, and so Iris was stuck. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a twinge of pity for her. She was still the child I'd once helped learn basic arithmetic at the kitchen table. But pity doesn't overwrite the sting of betrayal. She had made her choice: disrespect and dismiss me. Now she had to deal with the fallout. I recall one particularly telling moment when Iris and Serena cornered me in the living room after a long day at work. Iris apologized in a voice I found unconvincing. She repeated that she realized I was the only real father figure she'd ever had, that she was sorry for calling me just one of the husbands, that she'd been angry and didn't mean it. Her eyes flicked to Serena, who gave a small, encouraging nod as if to say, "Keep going." She sounded coached, like she was reading lines from a script. Then she said, "Please, if you help me finish this year, I'll pay you back, I promise." The old me might have melted at that, but I had replayed her original words in my head too many times. She'd said, I was nobody, not worth listening to. A father-child bond can endure a lot, but it doesn't easily survive that kind of contempt. So I said, "I appreciate the apology, but you're an adult now. Welcome to adult life. Adults pay for themselves. I'm sorry, but I'm done." She bit her lip, tears forming. Serena glared at me, calling me cruel. Perhaps it was cruel, but if I caved then, nothing would change. They'd trample my boundaries again. I still had some sense of fatherly affection left, but I refused to be manipulated. I wish I could say everything improved after that. In truth, it got worse. Serena started arguing day and night, claiming that I was letting petty grudges destroy our family. I pointed out that no one had consulted me when it came to the large tasks of child rearing, except to demand my income. She denied it, but we both knew the truth. The wedge grew until, one night, she and Iris packed their belongings and left to stay at a relative's place. I can't say I was surprised. For a month, our house was empty except for me. I carried on with my job, continued developing the sideline project, and found an odd sense of peace. I missed having companionship, but not the tension and drama. The echo of footsteps in empty rooms reminded me that a family once lived here, yet maybe it wasn't the family I'd always envisioned. Maybe it was just me, playing the role of caretaker for people who never genuinely cared for me. During that quiet month, I also received shocking news from the folks at Builders Forge. They were shutting down one of the production lines, laying off dozens of employees, myself included. I faced the potential of losing the steady income that had kept me afloat for years, but for once, luck was on my side. My small but growing tool business was poised to become something more than just a sideline. Luca and I decided to go all in. We pooled our resources, took a calculated risk, and committed to launching a full-fledged manufacturing company. Let us call it Precision Makers. We rented a modest warehouse, hired a handful of skilled workers, and set up our own small production line. When we told our old contacts from Builders Forge that we were venturing out on our own, some of them quickly signed on as clients, wanting to support us. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. I thrived on that challenge. For the first time in years, I felt I was building something that recognized my efforts. If I stayed up late, it was to finalize a contract that would yield tangible rewards for me, not just funnel money toward an ungrateful household. My days were busy, meetings with suppliers, guiding workers through processes, testing product quality. At night, I'd lie awake, feeling a strange blend of excitement and apprehension. A part of me wondered if Serena or Iris would come back. Another part wondered if I wanted them to. As my business took shape, Serena's side of the story unraveled in ways I only learned through mutual acquaintances. I heard that Brandon, still absent, had let Iris down repeatedly, offering no meaningful financial or emotional support. She tried to juggle extra shifts at a local store, let's call it Value Mart, where she lugged boxes and stacked shelves for minimal pay. She resented every hour. She confided in a friend that she wished she'd never said what she did, that it felt humiliating to beg me for funds I would no longer provide. But humiliation alone wasn't enough to mend the rift. She realized too late that once you betray someone in certain ways, forgiveness doesn't come easily. Sometimes not at all. Meanwhile, Serena's relatives grumbled that they didn't want to host her and Iris forever. They expected me to ride in, pick them up, and deposit them back into the house, but that phone call never came. I didn't contact them, and they didn't contact me. I don't know if they expected me to chase after them with apologies. I had no interest in that. I was content to let them see what it was like to not rely on me. A quiet sense of retribution played in my chest whenever I heard rumors that Iris was struggling, or that Serena was outraged at the cost of groceries. None of this was hidden or subtle. They knew I was running my own company now, becoming more financially comfortable than ever. I wouldn't say I was wealthy, but I was doing well, likely better than the entire time I was with them. Of course, they saw it as if I'd suddenly decided to hoard wealth. From my perspective, I was simply focusing on myself for the first time in over a decade. Month by month, I shaped my new life. The house felt large and hollow, but it was mine. I let the garden overgrow a bit. Not out of laziness, but because it felt freeing to ignore chores that once felt like obligations. Instead, I spent weekends hammering away at new prototypes or going on hikes to clear my head. I discovered the joy of ordering takeout and only having to consider my own tastes. I discovered that I was worth something outside of being a father figure or a breadwinner. I had ideas, vision, ambition. People gossiped, though. A neighbor, let's call her Mia, asked me if I felt lonely without a family at home. I told her the truth. Yes, sometimes, but I don't feel lonely for them specifically. I feel lonely for the idea of a family that maybe never existed. She gave me a sympathetic nod, but I think she understood. I wasn't pining after Serena and Iris. I was mourning the illusions I once had. Occasionally, I'd get a call from an unknown number. Sometimes it was Iris, or sometimes Serena, or one of Serena's siblings. They'd try to guilt me, saying that I should at least support Iris's education, that I had a responsibility. I'd calmly reply, I have done all I can, and I think that's enough. They'd call me stubborn or heartless, but I'd hang up each time feeling only a slight tremor in my chest. I was beyond letting their words define me. As the months turned into a year, the final blow to any shred of reconciliation came when Iris decided to drag me into a family mediation. I think she hoped that official involvement, some relative playing the role of mediator, would persuade me to rethink my stance and pay for her education. She invited me to meet in the living room of Serena's sister. It was a cramped space, filled with chairs borrowed from neighbors. Iris sat on one side, Serena next to her, arms folded. On the other side sat a few extended relatives. I took a seat alone, facing them all. Iris started with a rehearsed speech about how she regretted ever saying I was nobody, how she missed the security of our home, and so on. She tried to phrase it as a heartfelt apology, but it felt hollow. Her tone was calm, but her eyes had that same defiance. Next, Serena said she too regretted the breakdown in our marriage, but believed we could overcome it if I would resume paying for Iris's education. She insisted that families fight, but ultimately forgive. I took a moment to gather my thoughts, scanning the eyes of everyone watching. Some glared at me, some looked hopeful. I said, I appreciate that you've invited me to discuss this, but I don't see how you can demand forgiveness on your terms, especially since you've never truly acknowledged that you used me for years without giving me basic respect. I watched as Iris's face contorted in resentment. I continued, I know people make mistakes, but you can't expect me to keep throwing away my money and self-esteem. You made your choice. You said I was a temporary presence. Well, you should act accordingly. An older aunt tried to scold me, telling me I was being too harsh, that life was too short for grudges. I looked at her and replied, then perhaps Iris shouldn't have done what she did if she didn't want lasting consequences. I turned to Iris. I have no desire to hurt you, but I also have no desire to help you anymore. With that, I stood and walked out, ignoring the chorus of disapproval that followed me to the door. That was the moment I realized there would be no neat resolution. Sometimes people who betray you want you to fix things, to pretend it never happened, so they can repeat the cycle. I wasn't going back to that. In the aftermath, I poured all my energy into building precision makers. Luca and I secured more contracts, and my life blossomed into something fulfilling. I learned new skills: management, negotiation, marketing. I even expanded our line of specialized tools. I met new people, discovered new corners of my own capabilities. There were times when a subtle pang of sorrow hit me, because I had once wanted a united family with Serena and Iris. But that pang was overshadowed by the memory of how they treated me. If I was truly as insignificant to them as Iris once claimed, then they wouldn't miss me now. What about revenge on Brandon, you might ask? In a way, it found him on its own. He tried to get a foot in the door with a local contracting company. let's call it handy prose, hoping to impress them with some elaborate pitch. But everyone in our town knew about his flakiness. Word travels fast in smaller communities. They turned him down, citing his unreliability. Last I heard, he was struggling with odd jobs, living paycheck to paycheck, and occasionally complaining that I had cut him off, as if I'd ever owed him anything. Serena and Iris, after that mediation fiasco, stopped reaching out. They tried to paint me as the villain who refused to see reason. Maybe in their perspective, I was. People who never accept responsibility often turn the blame outward, but ironically, their efforts to shame me only strengthened my resolve. I was done being the convenient scapegoat. Time marched on. My nights were quieter, but my spirit was lighter. Over 13 years, I had constantly worried about living up to expectations. Fatherly advice, fatherly finances, fatherly comfort. But I was never recognized as an official father. They didn't want me in that role, except when they needed money. Their betrayal was cruel, but it also set me free. The last piece of the puzzle came some months ago when a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Iris, apparently. No return address. Inside, she wrote a single page, apologizing one more time. She claimed she had grown, that she had recognized how toxic it was to treat me like a disposable figure. She said she knew she could never fully mend the damage, but she wanted me to know she understood how deeply she had hurt me. She also mentioned that she had switched majors, found a better fit at her smaller school, and was determined to make it on her own now. The letter ended with, "I hope one day you can forgive me, but if you can't, I understand." I folded the letter, slid it back into its envelope, and kept it in a drawer. I didn't reply. Maybe it was genuine. Maybe she wanted absolution. My heart, however, wasn't ready to give it. Some betrayals heal slowly, if at all. She had shaped her path. I had shaped mine. Our intersection was a memory,